Hello and welcome and namaste from New Delhi. You're watching DD India Live. I'm Gautam Roy and coming up in the next 30 minutes. Fresh fighting reported on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border with over a dozen civilian and military deaths after weekend clashes where dozens more had been killed. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says firepower is coming to Ukraine through Europe buying US weapons as NATO defense ministers meet in Brussels. The International Monetary Fund revises India's GDP growth forecast upwards to 6.6% from 6.4% in July for the year 2025-26, despite Donald Trump's tariff pressure, the highest in developing economies. And Israel says one of the 4 bodies handed over by the Hamas overnight does not match any of the hostages. It has threatened to restrict aid into Gaza and delay reopening of the Rafah crossing if handing over of remaining bodies is delayed. Now, fresh fighting has broken out on Wednesday along the volatile Pakistan-Afghanistan border, killing more than a dozen civilians and troops to shatter a fragile peace after weekend clashes which killed dozens of others. The Afghan Taliban said more than a dozen of its civilians were killed and 100 wounded as Pakistani forces launched attacks in the early hours of Wednesday in the district of Spin Boldak. Pakistan said 4 of its civilians were wounded in attacks by Taliban forces in the district of Chaban, which is opposite Spin Boldak across the frontier. The recent friction between the 2 former allies erupted after Islamabad demanded that the Afghan Taliban administration tackle militants who have stepped up attacks in Pakistan, saying they operate from havens in Afghanistan. NATO defense ministers have gathered in Brussels for talks to discuss support for Ukraine and to defend their borders after multiple drone incursions across Europe. Ahead of the meeting, NATO chief Mark Rutte said that the session will focus on how to make our deterrence and defense even stronger, adding that the military alliance and the European Union were working together in their efforts to set up a drone wall to protect member countries from drone incursions. He also said that the EU and NATO had different roles, with NATO providing capabilities on the military side and the EU holding the soft power of the internal market and making sure that the money is there.
We'll touch on all those issues and, of course, on what happened just recently, the drones, how to make sure that we can do even more to protect NATO against also these new developments. So this will be an important day. I can assure you that the EU and NATO are really working very well together. There is no doubling at all. Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, myself, the relevant commissioners, including Kubilius and of course Kaja Kallas and the others, we are all making sure that we make use of the strengths of the 2 organizations.
And US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth on Wednesday has said commitments from NATO countries will translate into enhanced capabilities for Ukraine. Speaking in the Belgian capital of Brussels ahead of the defense ministers' meeting at the NATO headquarters, Hegseth said the increase of firepower will benefit Ukraine through the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List program, which has been developed by the US and allies to supply Ukraine with new weapons.
Mark mentioned it. Firepower. That's what is coming, we expect and is coming from NATO. And it was a historic summit just a couple of months ago, brought about by leadership of President Trump to say we need our allies to step up. And they did, and they have in those commitments. Now those commitments will soon translate into capabilities, which is the most important aspect of it. And one part of that, of course, is Pearl, is the initiative where European countries buy U.S. weapons transferred to NATO for the fight in Ukraine to bring peace to that conflict. And if there's anything we've learned under President Trump, is the active application of peace through strength.
Now, does this mean enhanced firepower for Ukraine will have Tomahawks? That remains to be seen. Meanwhile, Germany said that it will spend 10 billion euros or 11.62 billion US dollars in the coming years for all kinds of drones. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius said at a meeting of NATO defense ministers in Brussels, and added that if Russian president tests their borders, they would react decisively. Now, Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak has said on Wednesday that Russia is ready for dialogue on gas supplies to Europe. Speaking at an energy forum in Moscow, Novak said that the global demand for energy is growing, both regarding hydrocarbons and also renewable energy.
Es gibt definitiv keine Anlässe zu vermuten.
Cooperation grows. We are prepared to engage. We have the necessary energy resources. As you know, Russia ranks first in gas reserves and second in gas production. We are ready to continue this cooperation naturally, terms of mutual benefit and partnership.
Updates from the West Asian region now, or Middle East. The Israeli army has confirmed that the fourth body handed over by the Hamas has not been matched to any of the captives. The IDF, in a social media post, said this following the completion of an examination at the National Institute of Forensic Medicine. It further said that the Hamas is required to make all necessary efforts to return the deceased hostages. 3 of the 4 bodies of Israeli hostages in Gaza returned by the Hamas late Tuesday have been identified. The slain hostages were identified as 20-year-old Tamir Nimrodi, whose fate was unclear until his body was identified, 35-year-old Uriel Baruch, who was killed in the Nova Music Festival on the 7th of October itself in 2023, and his body was kidnapped to Gaza, while 53-year-old Eitan Levi, who was missing for over 2 months after the 7th of October attack, before the Israeli army informed his family that he was dead and his remains were held by the Hamas. The Hamas has so far released 20 living hostages and 8 remains under the US-brokered Gaza peace deal, still keeping 20 bodies that the Hamas is committed to handing over under the agreement. Meanwhile, 8 trucks rolled into Gaza on Wednesday and Israel resumed preparations to open the main Rafah crossing after a dispute over the return of the bodies of dead hostages that had threatened to derail the fragile ceasefire deal with the Hamas. Israel had threatened to keep Rafah shut and reduce aid supplies because the Hamas was returning bodies too slowly, showing the risks to a truce that has stopped 2 years of devastating warfare in Gaza and freed all living hostages held by the Hamas. However, the militant group returned more Israeli bodies overnight, and an Israeli security official said on Wednesday preparations were underway to open Rafah to Gazan citizens, while a second official said that 608 trucks would be going in. The Palestinian Authority says it's prepared to operate a key crossing for aid between Egypt and Gaza. Palestine's Special Envoy to President confirmed that an earlier agreement with the EU Border Assistance Mission to help manage the crossing remains valid. The crossing, which briefly reopened between February and March, had allowed vital humanitarian aid and medical evacuations from Gaza's healthcare system.
Rafah is a Palestinian-Egyptian matter. We had an agreement in 2005. It's called Access and Movement Agreement. And it does involve the European Eurocops, European police. And the Palestinian Authority police were there, and the Egyptians. So there were 3 parties: Egypt, Palestine, and the Eurocops. Now we are ready to engage again, and we have notified all parties that we are ready to operate the Rafah crossing.
Now, the European Union has often been criticized for burdening companies with too much bureaucracy. Now, the committee in Brussels is trying to cut down on some regulations. First, the supply chain law. Lars Holter is with Deutsche Welle and joins me from Berlin for more on that. Good evening to you, Lars. Now, what are you hearing from Brussels?
Thanks for having me. Yes, the EU Commission's Committee on Legal Affairs is out with some recommendations on that supply chain law, and they come pretty close to what the corporate community has been asking for. Now, to explain what we're talking about here, the EU's supply chain law is an important piece of legislation in many ways. It is in place to make sure that companies keep their supply chains clean by, for example, not allowing their suppliers to employ child labor or use slavery, or generally have unsafe or inhumane working conditions. Also, by forcing their suppliers to adhere to certain environmental standards, clean air, clean water, and such. So all this is, of course, very important. But the problem was, while companies agreed to these standards in general, of course, they had a hard time documenting everything.
Changes are now being proposed.
It's mostly about the documentation of supply chains. See, the problem has always been for the past few years, and basically for as long as the law had been in the making, the problem was that documentation is very costly. It takes a lot of effort for companies to follow their supply chains all the way to the raw materials and document things to the standard the EU had wanted to see. Especially small and medium-sized companies often said they would have to set up an entire new department to tackle the job, and that would have been cost prohibitive and definitely a competitive disadvantage in a world where companies outside the EU, let's look at Asia for example, already benefit from sometimes more lax regulation and mostly also a lower cost structure. So now the EU Legal Commission says that only companies of more than 5,000 employees and with revenues of more than 1.5 billion euros have to document their supply chain in detail. For Germany, that means that only 120 companies for now have to abide by the very strict rules of documentation instead of the almost 3,000 that had originally been targeted.
All right, so reform being brought in, always critical, especially in times which are sort of uncertain, and a hardship could be around the corner. Thanks a lot for joining us, Lars from Berlin. And still to come in this edition of DD India Live. EU Chief von der Leyen urges Serbia to carry out reforms before joining the European bloc. Indonesian oil tanker catches fire, at least 10 have been killed. And Kenyan President declares 7 days of state mourning after the passing of former Prime Minister Raila Amolo Odinga.
This week on Defence Dynamics, India's defence momentum gathers force. From new missile deals and production lines to deeper naval cooperation with India, New Delhi's strategic partnerships are setting new benchmarks. Meanwhile, a Chinese move that could disrupt global defence supply chains, raising fresh concerns amongst major powers. Plus, Pakistan's growing unease as India-Afghanistan ties move towards a new phase of cooperation and trust. Catch it all this Wednesday at 8 p.m. IST only on DD India.
Welcome back. You're watching DD India Live. I'm Gautam Roy. The European Union has invited Serbia to join its common joint gas procurement mechanism. EU Commission head Ursula von der Leyen said on Wednesday as Belgrade seeks to reduce its dependence on Russia, its main supplier. Serbia is almost entirely dependent on gas imports from Russia, which cover over 80% of the country's needs. In June, Serbia's energy ministry said it was working to integrate its gas and electricity markets with those of the EU by the end of 2027.
We are connecting Serbia to the EU's energy market. This is the true guarantee that Serbian families will be safe and warm in winter. And we have concrete projects in motion. We also invited Serbia to join the EU's joint gas procurement mechanism, because together we are using our collective market power to secure better energy prices.
At least 10 people have been killed and 18 injured after an oil tanker caught fire in Indonesia's Riau Islands province. The fire broke out at MT Federal 2 while it was docked and was undergoing repairs in Indonesia. Officials informed that the injured are receiving intensive care at several hospitals. The ownership of the vessel is still unknown. Also, authorities in Indonesia have raised the volcano emergency alert to its highest level after Mount Lewitobi Laki-Laki erupted on Wednesday. Roofs of homes in the village of Hikong in East Nusa Tenggara were blanketed by a layer of ash, sand and gravel after a tower of volcanic ash shot 10 kilometers up into the sky. There were no immediate reports of casualties or damage on Wednesday, but authorities have warned residents and tourists on the eastern Indonesian island of Flores to keep away from the mountain and prepare for possible evacuation. The volcano last erupted in August. It also erupted in July, causing flight disruptions to and from the nearby resort island of Bali. Raila Odinga, the former Prime Minister of Kenya, passed away at the age of 80. According to reports, Odinga suffered a cardiac arrest on Wednesday. The former PM was the perennial opposition figure of Kenyan politics and was at the center of Kenya's political journey since the 1990s. In an address to the nation, Kenya's President William Ruto announced 7 days of national mourning for Raila Odinga.
In honor of the Right Honorable Raila Amolo Odinga's extraordinary contribution to our nation, I have declared a 7-day period of national mourning, during which the national flag shall fly at half-mast across the Republic of Kenya and in all our missions abroad. Our former Prime Minister, Raila Amolo Odinga, shall be accorded a state funeral with all attendant honors.
Supporters took to the streets of Kisumu to mourn Kenyan opposition leader Odinga. Many were seen in shock and some held branches as a symbolic gesture of respect.
Wednesday for Kenya, and it is a dark Wednesday for the whole world, because today we are mourning an enigma. We are mourning one person who has fought for this country ever since.
The death of Raila has been a shock to us. We as the youth and the ODM champions, we knew Raila as a father. Raila was an enigma. Raila was a pragmatic leader. Raila was a futuristic leader. And Raila Amolo Odinga was a man of peace.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi has expressed grief over the demise of former Kenyan Prime Minister. In a post on X, the PM wrote, and I quote, "Deeply saddened by the passing away of my dear friend and former Prime Minister of Kenya, Mr. Raila Odinga. He was a towering statesman and a cherished friend of India. I had the privilege of knowing him closely since my days as Chief Minister of Gujarat, and our association continued over the years. He had a special affection for India, our culture, values and ancient wisdom. This was reflected in his effort to strengthen India-Kenya ties. He particularly admired Ayurveda and traditional medicine systems of India, having witnessed their positive impact on his daughter's health. I extend my deepest condolences to his family, friends, and to the people of Kenya in this hour of grief." The International Monetary Fund, in its latest report, has raised India's GDP growth forecast for 2025 to 6.6% from the previous 6.4% in July in its economic outlook forecast. The October outlook increased India's growth projections by 20 basis points, reflecting a strong Q1 carryover. The IMF has highlighted that India has recorded the strongest upside surprise among all emerging market and developing economies. India's Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal has expressed optimism over the recent growth estimates released by the IMF on India's GDP rate touching 6.6% this year. Minister Goyal was speaking to the media on the sidelines of an event in New Delhi.
इंटरनेशनल मॉनेटरी फंड IMF के लेटेस्ट एस्टिमेट्स के द्वारा हमारे इस वर्ष की विकास की दरों में वृद्धि की गई है। IMF ने एस्टिमेट किया है कि अब भारत का ग्रोथ रेट 6.6% हो जाएगा और प्रधानमंत्री मोदी जी के नेतृत्व में भारत निश्चित विश्व की सबसे तेज गति से बढ़ने वाली अर्थव्यवस्था इस साल भी रहेगी, आगे आने वाले कई वर्षों तक बनी रहेगी और 2047 तक जो विकसित भारत बनाने का दृढ़ संकल्प लेके देश चला है उसमें हम अवश्य सफलता पाएंगे.
And Piyush Goyal also delivered the keynote address at the plenary session of the Indian Chemicals and Petrochemical Conference 2025 held in New Delhi. Organized by the Confederation of Indian Industries, the conference highlighted the significant contributions of initiatives like Make in India, PLI, Gati Shakti and the National Logistics Policy. A report on building India's chemical workforce for a USD $1 trillion economy, underscoring the importance of collaboration between government, academia and industry to foster innovation, sustainability and talent development was also launched on the occasion. Addressing the conference, the minister highlighted the country's need to ensure supply chain resilience through diversified sources and protecting domestic value chains where needed.
We certainly don't want to be left at the mercy of one geography or even one or two geographies on any item in our supply chains, which can cripple our entire sector. We will need diversified sources. There may be items where we need solid protection and we need to have that domestic value chain in sufficient quantity to make sure our entire sector does not become vulnerable.
India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has said that next-gen GST has been beneficial for the people. Speaking during an event in Koppal in the southern Indian state of Karnataka, the FM added that GST rates on several items have been brought down.
नवरात्रि के पहले से ही हमने उसको पालन किया, इसीलिए बहुत सारे आइटम्स के ऊपर टैक्स कटौती हुई, कम हुई. किसानों के उपयोग वाले वस्तुओं के ऊपर भी टैक्स कम हुआ है. सोलर पावर्ड इक्विपमेंट या आपके ट्रैक्टर, टिलर, एग्रीकल्चरल मशीनरी, पूरे के पूरे जितने भी किसान अन्नदाता उपयोग करते हैं उन सब में जीएसटी का कम रेट हो गया है, 5% या कभी कंप्लीट वेवर भी हुआ है.
The 5th edition of bilateral maritime exercise Samudra Shakti hosted by the Indian Navy is underway at Visakhapatnam. The participating units include IST Bharati under the aegis of Eastern Naval Command and the Indonesian Navy ship KRI John Lee, a corvette with an integral helicopter. The joint drill will culminate on the 17th of October. Exercise Samudra Shakti is a key bilateral engagement aimed at enhancing interoperability, strengthening mutual understanding and sharing best practices between the two navies. The exercise highlights shared commitment of both the nations towards maintaining stability and peace in the Indo-Pacific region. India's Supreme Court has relaxed firecracker ban conditions in Delhi NCR region ahead of Diwali and allowed bursting of green crackers from the 18th to the 21st of this month. Bursting of green firecrackers will be allowed from 6 in the morning till 7 on Diwali and again from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. in the evening. The top court said it has to take a balanced approach, permitting bursting of green firecrackers in moderation while not compromising with the environment. The court ordered police authorities to constitute patrolling teams to keep an eye that only permitted products with QR codes are to be sold, while no firecrackers will be allowed in the Delhi NCR region from the outside. In strict action, the top court has also ordered that if fake firecrackers are found, licenses will be suspended. As autumn has arrived, bringing in mists and clouds due to temperature variations, covering the Aigle city in Switzerland with fog and clouds giving it a mystical makeover, while trees in alpine foothills change shades, adding colors to the atmosphere. Well, that misty vista wraps up this edition of DD India Live, but let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. And for those on the go, you can get all the latest news and updates from India and across the world on DD India's mobile app. It's available on both Android and iOS. Just scan the QR code on the screen and download the app. And we'll be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Gautam Roy, and from all of us out here in Delhi, thanks for watching DD India Live.